Welcome to video lecture 11 on St. Thomas's teaching of the problem of the one and the many, his metaphysical teaching. I'm going to be talking this class about the relationship of Aristotle's four causes to a lot of the topics I've been discussing recently, such as virtual quantity and the divisions and methods of the sciences, and also regarding organizational unity or organizational wholeness, which relates to the St. Thomas and Aristotle's teaching about being a measure, which is the means, as you might recall, of knowing quantity, and quantity is the means by which we know organizational unity. Right? And the measure tells us, basically, the measure of a thing tells us its organizational wholeness, the strength of its intrinsic unity. This is what the ancient Greeks were chiefly concerned about when they were studying philosophy, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. The ancient Greeks and Romans tended to be people who were very much concerned about understanding the nature of political organizations, social organizations, and in order to do that, they had to understand what gave these organizations their unity, how you could know, how you could quantify in different ways the strength of unity that existed within these multitudes. Now, quantifying political unity, obviously, is not the same thing as quantifying numbers. The same thing as if you're quantifying health. If you're measuring the health, you're measuring the strength of unity, of organic harmony, in a way. So having lost our focus of attention on that kind of qualitative element about unity and the notion of a measure itself, we've gone off on a tangent in Western culture and have lost our understanding of what was the chief pursuit of classical philosophy and also of theology, since it was in light of being able to answer these Greek and Roman philosophical questions that Christian culture was able to convert the pagan culture and answer the philosophical problems that this culture had better than the philosophers were able to do, and that this attracted these people to convert to Christianity. So to revive the West, in a way, one of the things that we have to do is to get back to a classical understanding of what philosophy meant for the ancient Greeks and Romans. And this is one of the chief purposes of going over this course, to renew the culture, to renew the West by renewing a classical understanding of physics and reuniting philosophy and wisdom. Okay, so to start this video lecture 11, I want to review once again the 6 topics that I considered in video lecture 10, and just going to read them once again. Look down at my notes here, and to recall the fact that the knower and the thing known belong to the same organization. They're extremes of an organizational relationship, and that requires that the thing known have a different intrinsic measure, a different organizational wholeness to it, that the knower is seeking to comprehend. And the knower is going to try to seek that by means of replicating in organizational activities of the intellect and imagination and conceptualization, activities that are going on within the thing known. And those are some of the topics I'm going to talk about today. How St. Thomas distinguishes the scientific knower from the thing known. That has to do with the intrinsic measures of the way in which unity is more or less completely possessed by the thing, its intrinsic measure, and the intrinsic measure of the intellect, how powerful an intellect is. If you recall the way St. Thomas distinguished the power of the angelic intellect by the intensity with which, by means of fewer ideas, it was or is able to extend to a greater multitude of things known about the created order in fewer acts. So the intensive quantum of the thing known and the intensive quantum of the knower constitute the extremes of a measuring relationship. And the whole of science consists in the unification of these two measures in a single understanding. What the knower contributes to completing the formal object of a science. I went over this to recall your understanding of what a formal object is, how we understand a science. Very often today we think that philosophy and science are simply based upon historical experience, and that we can somehow define the subject of a science or of a division of philosophy based upon history, or sometimes not even that, based upon dreams, based upon imagining. But St. Thomas and Aristotle, and previous to him even, in the works of Plato and Socrates, and in the physicists, you see the ancient thinkers focusing attention on the organization of the material thing, and how this activates human powers, and using that as the means for defining the subject of a philosophy, as science as a whole, or for the different disciplines. So they were constantly looking at the thing for internal principles of organization, organizational wholeness, internal measures, by means of which they could understand how different faculties on the part of a human being were activated, and this relationship between this internal measure and this faculty being measured by the measure in the thing, by its the wholeness of its organizational unity, were the means by which they divided up the sciences. That was the way they got their divisions, because there was a kind of intrinsic necessity, right? And a level of immateriality in the thing, and there was a kind of dematerializing power on the part of the human intellect that could provide for the human intellect a dematerialized subject that became its formal object. Right? The ancients using the term subject and object oppositely to the way we use them today. The object for them is the thing known, or that which has been generated by the external subject. So being a subject meant something had external existence. Being an object meant that the power had been activated by some organizational unity existing in operation and activating an internal power, giving it a dematerialized subject through which it considered the internal organization of the thing. That process is complicated and helps to distinguish the different kinds of sciences, the arts and sciences that we have. I then went over to give examples of this process of hierarchy of science is based upon dematerializing the object, and why metaphysics is more intellectual, more scientific than mathematics. Because it's more intellectual. The dematerializing activity that's involved in it is more immaterial. To understand this, you have to recall that for us to be able to know something outside of us and to do so in a scientific and impartial way, the knower has to remain the same, the thing known has to remain the same as the thing known acts on the knower. Neither the knower can change nor can the thing known change. If either of them changes, then the knower is not knowing the thing, or the thing that is being known by the knower is a different thing. They've been altered. So knowing is actually a living act in which neither the knower nor the thing known is essentially changing. They have to remain identical in some way and permanent and constitute a living union, so that when a person is engaged in intense intellectual activity, people experience this even doing activities like driving, where they don't become separate from the road. When a person becomes immersed in knowing a subject matter, the subject known and the thing that's the person who's doing the knowing become one part of one living act. Why the subject of a science cannot be identical with the formal object or subject that makes a science or division of philosophy theoretical, practical, or productive? Well, once again, because of the different aims. What makes it an object scientific is the fact that you're dealing with something that's necessary, and it's been dematerialized and therefore removed from the conditions of matter and motion, as St. Thomas says. And it's got an internal necessity to it, a measure of wholeness, of unity. It can only be in one way. It's permanent. What makes it to be speculative is the fact that we're aiming at thinking speculatively rather than aiming at production or practice. The sixth topic we covered was how philosophy, science is a personally caused act, right? And why this makes the human person a first principle of science, and not just what we know, but it's the way we know it, the method. The methods being chiefly the virtues, the habits that are being used through which this abstraction process and conclusion process is developed. Okay, now, having gone through that review, I'm going to cover the first three topics again out of the 6 topics in this video lecture 11. And the first 3 deal with Aristotle's 4 causes and the way they relate to contrary opposition through unequal possession of organizational wholeness. That is, an organization's intrinsic measure of unity is something that the 4 causes let us indicate to us, and they do this by enabling us initially to imagine the activity that is going on within the subject that we're studying, so as to generate within our own psychological activities a replication of the activities that are going on in the thing, operational principles. This process, as I said, is complicated, and the more that a person has experience in working with a subject, the more a person is able to imagine the kinds of causal activities that are at play. Imagining is not a static type of picturing. Right? It involves judging, and it involves organization. The ability to use external signs, right? To be able to unify or to be able adequately to represent, to associate in an organizational way on the level of the imagination. Right? And imaginative models very often that we use is the means through which we understand the internal unity that a thing has and the kind of internal unity that it has. Now, when you take a look at that imaginative medium, the phantasm that St. Thomas sometimes talks about, it's evident that this is something that is composed of these four causes. Because we're trying to imagine organizational unity. If you can't imagine organizational unity, you can't conceive of it. And so the necessary condition for you to being able to explain the causes at work in an intellectual fashion is to first envision the causes at work in an imaginative way. And we can't do that unless we can imagine the end or the aim growing out of the principle of unity. And so the way that Aristotle conceived of the final cause was as the formal cause having grown into or maturely developed into an organization. So the final cause is the principle of unity. This principle of unity is being conceived as a composite whole in an immaturely developed way that is growing into the maturely developed whole, the incipient organization growing into the maturely developed organization. That is generating an action. So that action that it's generating is the product of the, or it's what satisfies the aim. And the beginning and the end here, the final and the formal causes, are to some extent opposites. Right? The immature possession and the mature possession of a kind of a unity, right? The extremes of unity, and that they come to to belong to the same subject through the material and the efficient causes, right? The material cause being that out of which the activity is being generated, and or into which some activity is being caused. So there's a kind of an opposition among all of these causes that enable us to know wholeness, which is the point that I'm trying to get at. You can't understand a multitude as a whole, as I've said several times in these lectures, unless you can unify that multitude into parts of a whole. Without the aim, you can't do that, because you don't have any order. You don't have a hierarchy or possession of that unity that is able to generate operations operations. Even if you're not thinking of an organization as fully equipped to generate operations, you're thinking about it as prepared to do so, like a police department or a fire department that hasn't hired anybody yet to work. Still, there's this relationship to achieving this one act, satisfying this one act, on the part of this material, right? So that substance that Aristotle would talks about. So the matter that you're talking about, which contains the unity, right, is one of those four causes that explains how these opposite extremes of form, how the underdeveloped form and the developed form can coexist, and one can grow out of the other. It's only in light of the aim that the maturely developed final cause is basically the formal cause in growing into mature development as an organization. The material to which both the final and the formal cause belong, right, has an efficiency to it, that an activity that it is generating that causes this opposition to grow. So those four causes are basically the four elements or the four parts that have to be united in order to constitute an operational whole, as well as a unitary whole. And I mentioned before how Father Crowley had recognized the internal constitution of physical things being those measures that give it a kind of internal unity. Well, Father Maurer was very much aware of the fact that organizational unity, operational unity, is a distinctive characteristic of the divisions and the methods of the sciences, because the sciences are concerned with operations, and how we are able to know scientifically through different methods. So the Metaphysics of St. Thomas combines, in a way, both the research of Crowley and the research of Maurer, one focusing attention on principles of organization and operation and how these are known by the mind, and the other Crowley focusing on principles of unity, by means of which we come to understand organizational wholeness. Recall that for St. Thomas, we cannot understand how a thing can act unless we first recognize a thing to be complete as a substance. That is, it has to have the unity, organizational unity, to be the kind of being that it is before it can act. The second question I wanted to consider here in video lecture 11 is how the external and internal sense faculties act as scientific philosophical principles to replicate imaginative likenesses that are going on in things, so that we can judge about them. If you recall, causes replicate their activity in the things upon which they act. So this means that if an internal action is going on in things that's being reflected in signs through external activity, the faculties that know them have to, in some way, have that organizational unity, that wholeness, replicated in each of them as the process of scientific knowing proceeds. So, just as you can't have a scientific understanding without being able to judge in a scientific way and to conceive something scientifically, and you can't conceive scientifically unless you can imagine a scientific or an organization in some way on the imaginative level. So you have to be sensing externally some sort of organizational relationship through the signs, and recognizing on the external sense level a type of unity and opposition that is going on within things, which is part of our everyday experience, because it's through these active experience, if you recall, for Aristotle and St. Thomas, that we become familiar with things on an artistic and scientific level. And until we can imagine that and judge on the sense level through sense memory, until we can come up with a sense whole, and in this sense a universal relationship that the memory is constructing for us in relationship to what we've imagined, until we know that when giving this person this medication, when this person has these symptoms, that this helped this person and did so universally, without a universal that is in some way experienced on the sense level through the imagination, not through a universal concept, but through a universal relationship that is grasped through our memories of individual acts, this primitive type of imaginative universal. Without that experience, we can't transcend that and come up with the adequate type of imaginable experience to proceed further scientifically. So, this third question follows upon this second question very easily. How, through these different acts of imagining and conceiving and reasoning and judging, scientific and philosophical explanation consists in communicating, articulating to ourselves and to others the organizational wholeness a scientist philosopher has come to recognize exists within the nature of a scientific subject. Until we are able to grasp in a single understanding that organizational wholeness that we are experiencing in the thing that we know, until we recognize that thing being possessed of parts, and recognizing the way that they are inclined to unite and divide, are able to express to ourselves how this single subject is actually a distinctive type of organizational unity with a distinctive type of indivisibility to it, a resistance and a receptivity to act and to be acted upon. We don't know it. And we can't tell ourselves precisely what it is, and we can't tell anybody else precisely what it is. This is one of the reasons why students of St. Thomas have had such difficulty over the centuries explaining to students of St. Thomas precisely what are his teachings about topics such as analogy, because they have not understood what he meant by a substance. That the organization that he was chiefly talking about. Etienne Gilson talked about for much of his adult professional life, how the students of St. Thomas did not understand his teaching about the existence, and how because they didn't understand his teaching about existence, they couldn't possibly understand his metaphysics. Well, the same is true about his teaching about unity. Because existence and unity are analogously predicated. If you don't understand St. Thomas's teaching about unity in terms of an organization, then you can't understand how he talks about truth or goodness or beauty or any of the operations that are performed through this transcendental way of talking. So the internal organization that a thing has is not only important for understanding science and philosophy and the divisions of science and philosophy, but it's also important for understanding how we extend this principle of unity and multiplicity and intrinsic measures, right, to different disciplines, and to our way of explaining to ourselves the nature of philosophy, the nature of science, the nature of art, the nature of our own understanding. Well, I'm going to leave off at this point and come back to the last three questions in video lecture 11. Welcome to video lecture 11, part 2 of St. Thomas Aquinas' metaphysical teaching about the one and the many, where I had been talking about Aristotle's four causes and their relation to virtual quantity and to organizational wholeness and the divisions and methods of the sciences. And I had mentioned in passing in that lecture and in previous ones that the notion of measure enables us to determine the limits of unity, of wholeness that exist within an organization. In a sense, what a measure does is it portions out a unity within an organization. It places limits on it, and it also determines the possession of unity, the simplicity with which unity is held and possessed. In doing this, it helps us to understand the natures of different organizations, and it's the reason why we very often use measure and nature synonymously. It's been done historically in a lot of works and scriptural texts, among others, and we continue to do this even today. The ancient Greeks sometimes used the notion of number for species. They considered them to be interchangeable, and measure is the means, once again, for knowing numbers. So it's the means for being able to understand the way in which a species possesses the generic unity and therefore can more or less exercise organizational perfection in action, or organizational completeness. Now, what I want to do now is to consider this question of an organizational whole a little bit more from the standpoint of philosophy and science considered as an organizational whole and its chief aim. St. Thomas indicates that the chief aim of philosophy considered as a whole, or science considered as a whole, is human happiness. Now, he divides, like Aristotle does, human happiness in a twofold way, into theoretical and practical. And a common practice among students of St. Thomas and Aristotle is at times to divide those into three, talking about theoretical, practical, and productive divisions of philosophy and of science. Now, if science and philosophy are identical, then this is not only true for St. Thomas and for Aristotle, but it's true for all time. If the way we divide philosophy, or the way we identify the subject of philosophy, the subject of science, is in relationship of a formal object to a facultative power, to the extent that those human faculties remain the same and the organizational constitution of things is what's activating things, the formal object, then it's in relationship to those, to that unity that's constituted by the formal object acting on the faculty that determines the subject matter of a science, what it is. And the subject matter of philosophy for all time is related to human happiness. That's an essential part of its genus. It's an essential part of theoretical, practical, and productive philosophy or science. This means that the whole of speculative philosophy, as well as other divisions of philosophy, like service activities, or practical activities that are involved in bodily development or in fine arts, or those that are related to manufacturing, business activities. All of those have as an essential part of their nature and definition the pursuit of happiness as satisfying wonder. Right? So this is one of the reasons why businesses want to satisfy customers and are constantly taking surveys, opinion surveys, to see whether their organizational operations are delivering the product to a satisfied customer in a satisfied way, because they are seeking to the extent that it's possible for them to promote happiness among human beings. Now, there's an order among these sciences. Strictly speaking, for Aristotle and for St. Thomas, philosophy is speculative or theoretical, and analogously it's said of these other divisions of science as well, or of philosophy. Aristotle notes this hierarchy in relationship to practical and productive sciences by giving the example of the art of sailing governing the art of shipbuilding. That is, the way we manufacture things is determined by the way what we manufacture is put to use. If we want to change then the nature of manufacturing, change the nature of the way things are used, the way practices, people engage in practical activities, and productive activities become altered. This is a principle that people who are in the business of manufacturing should be aware of. There's also a relationship between delivering the enabling means of exercising a service, like controlling the instruments by means of which human beings are able to engage in services or to manufacture products. That is another example of a hierarchy that exists within practical sciences and arts. This is one of the reasons why countries very often want to control mineral reserves and resources, and why those people who are heavily invested in areas like the stock market very often invest in primary resources and pay attention to what happens to them, because that's going to influence the entire economic market. These are just a couple of the ways in which, going back to Thales, philosophers understood that there's a way in which the activity of philosophy has an extremely essential and practical dimension to it. In fact, the whole of philosophical activity involves work, which is not necessarily identical with practice, but it does involve, in an analogous way, practice put to use chiefly for the work of, say, the intellect, when you're talking about speculative knowing. So philosophy considered as a whole, or science considered as a whole, or generically, aims at generating human happiness within the human soul that in turn generates it within a human being. And this occurs for a human being when the activities in which we engage satisfy natural desire by uniting the human person with the formal object of human nature. So natural desire is not the same thing as the desire of the human will. It's something that even the human will has to take into consideration as something that naturally determines it. The human will naturally pursues, seeks to conform to the natural good of a human being, which is the satisfaction, the natural satisfaction of all human desire by being attached to that which activates human nature by causing human nature to exist and to possess the faculties that we do. Now, we satisfy human nature in that way by perfecting our individual operations. So each of our faculties has a natural excellence or virtue that it inclines to satisfy, to fulfill in a maturely developed way in the exercise of its specific operations. And so the operations that we engage in the different arts and different sciences are engaged in so that we can perfect our psychological habits of mind, like our imagination and memory through the liberal arts, as well as our own intellect through the application of logical reasoning process to ordering and organizing our intellect, the sciences like physics, understanding the causes that exist in the physical universe, that perfect our ability to engage in our external sensing, and as well as in our internal sensing, our imagination, which mathematics helps to perfect, and helps us to understand the unity in things, much like our external senses help us to understand in a more precise and exact way the operations of things. This understanding of the nature of unity inclines us to pursue higher causes for understanding the unity of everything. That inclines us to think metaphysically, which is a perfection of the human soul. So each of our operations, in some way, is ordered towards, as St. Thomas sees, is ordered toward perfecting the human faculties. This is why we engage in these activities, just like we use different instruments to engage in other natural activities, like a fork or a knife. They're organs. Our faculties are organs, in a sense, not that they're physical, but they're instruments by means of which we perfect ourselves as people in pursuing human happiness. Now, there are implications related to this regarding precisely how we name people, philosophers and scientists. This means that philosophy, in fact, a sign of the truth of what I'm talking about here is the observation that Aristotle makes of how philosophy developed after the development of a moral culture by religious groups in Egypt. When Egypt had been able to develop a leisured class through the development, the perfection of manual labor, where a certain amount of wealth had been generated so that you could have a group of people separated and living a religious life where they had the free time to be able to engage in moral and cultural development. In other words, without a certain level of moral and cultural development that generates leisure within a culture, philosophy becomes impossible to exercise, to engage in. So people who dismiss that and who think that philosophy has no responsibilities toward the pursuit of aims or the pursuit of truth or anything like that are engaged in a kind of delusion. They're out of touch with the nature of the subject. this is contradicted, first of all, by the historical development of philosophy among the ancient Greeks, and just the ordinary experience that human beings have of living, and understanding that you can't engage in any kind of speculative activity, any kind of thinking for the sake simply of thinking, unless you have free time, unless you have leisure time that you can employ. Without arrangements, political arrangements that facilitate peace among human beings and dialogue to settle agreement, a certain level of democratic culture or republican culture within a community, the practice of philosophy cannot be generated. The principles are not there. It requires remote political principles for it to come into existence. This means that people who are not concerned about that, or who think, for example, that causes do not matter in relationship to philosophy, or aims, that philosophy somehow can be aimless. The reasoning process can be just aimless, and anything you want to call philosophy can be philosophy, are simply wrong-headed. They don't understand the nature of the subject matter. They're talking, they are what Plato called philosophical bastards in Book 7 of the Republic, to put it in more vulgar, that is, common terms. And that's an accurate translation of the way of Plato's description. Philosophy, the denial of philosophy and science to have any relationship to happiness and to have an aim is the denial of the existence of philosophy and of happiness. And people who engage in it wind up destroying philosophical culture. They just wind up destroying the conditions for engaging in culture. If it's the case that you cannot have an organization without having an aim, and philosophy is an organizational activity, and everything we aim at as human beings relates to improving, maturely developing our own excellence in reasoning and choosing and judging and relating to things around us in the world, then part of the generic definition of philosophy is the pursuit of happiness. We wonder because we are seeking to become happy. And what puts the wonder to rest is some level of achievement, satisfaction of happiness as a psychological property. That's something that satisfies the emotions and the will as well as the intellect and perfects the human soul. So if we divorce philosophy from human happiness, thinks it has no connection to it, philosophy has no connection to aims whatsoever, what we've done is we've denied the proper nature of philosophy as St. Thomas understood it, and I think as is properly correct. The psychological aspect, oddly enough, is something that very often people neglect when considering philosophy. So, in considering how real aims are a part of the essential definition of philosophy, we come into a necessary consideration of this last question that I've asked in this lecture, namely how real aims and real leaders transform this indeterminate plurality into parts of a whole, and are the necessary condition for the existence and unity in any and every organization, and make philosophy and science possible. An aim is transmitted through to a multitude through some sort of a highest species within a genus, an organizational leader who is able to get the other members of the organization to cooperate to pursue a common aim. Without the leader who can keep the multitude focused on the common aim, you lose the chief measure of the unity within the organization. And this is one of the reasons why St. Thomas and Aristotle say the maximum of any genus is the measure of everything else in the genus, because the maximum in the genus is the leader of the distribution of unity throughout all of the other parts. It's that one part through which unity and the measure of unity that is possible within the organization becomes distributed throughout the organization, and therefore becomes like the main conductor of organizational unity and organizational operations. It's for this reason that the leader is the chief measure of organizational strength and the limits of action that occur within any kind of organization or any kind of group. So that I think more or less completes what I wanted to get through in video lecture 11, and I'll continue to try to put the terminology of St. Thomas in more contemporary terms, so that you get a better understanding of the way in which what he's talking about is not something in the remote past and doesn't have any relevance for your understanding about how to live your lives in our own period of time. I think it has much more relevance because it recovers an understanding of philosophy and of science that does not divorce these subjects from perfection of the human person and from perfection of human life. So in that sense, it repersonalizes philosophy, it repersonalizes science, and in the process helps to reconnect science and the whole of wisdom, philosophy and the whole of wisdom, which we sorely need in this period of time.